Out here. How you doing? Undoubt my friends. The sun's behind me. It's a little windy, so I hope you can make out without it being too annoying. I'm trying to see where the mic is to cover it. That side, I think it's on. Looks like it's on this side. All right. So I'll try to block the wind on this side by holding my hand around the mic and talking here. So I asked this question to Charles Hodgkinson, and it's a great question at any blockchain conference to ask. All right, you have a chance to ask a question. This is it. The blockchain was actually invented in 1991. Made Safe came out in 2007. Bitcoin 2009, and but it wasn't until Ethereum that the quote blockchain revolution actually took off. And why is that? And I'll tell you why. Because the term blockchain is erroneous. It's not the blockchain at all. Blockchain is just a distributed ledger. And what we have is an open innovation framework for launching innovation by, in fact, changing the centralization paradigm that prior to 2016, and actually you can say that was success as an entrepreneur launching a startup, came down to one's ability to access closed capital networks. And unfortunately, what's happening with the blockchain, that paradigm is getting reimposed. It was freed in 2016-17. The paradigm is slowly kind of coming back with VCs and others passing legislation and cutting down to try to take hold of this new vehicle, right, for them to maximize their income. Decentralization is just an outcome of OIF, the Open Innovation Framework that you call the blockchain. What is the real purpose? Let me tell you, as the inventor of OIF, as the guy who in 2011 sought out the founders of Bitcoin magazine, run by a guy called Matthew, had a very, on their team was the number 20 most important guy in Bitcoin, and also Vitalik, who was just a teenager back then, traveling around the world with Michal Alisi, his mentor, who I spent 2 months with from December 2012, December 2011, January 2012, explaining OIF and why it's going to change everything and why it's so damn important. But you see, you didn't get it. And even though you may be all excited about the blockchain, I'm going to tell you, we've opened up Pandora's box, and I'm going to explain what that is as I get up here. So, let me give some background. How did the whole idea of the Open Innovation Framework start? Well, it started with a dyslexic word. I meant to say startup or founder, and I came up and said the word found up in 2009 whilst I was driving down the road making a video. Found up. A found up was a founder with an idea for a startup. This is pre-crowdfunding era. This is pre all of the nonsense, not nonsense, but all the stuff that we're doing now. Anyway, Foundups came about because an idea of mine called WikiTube TV was validated by Google's YouTube when I shared basically the idea and the vision behind YouTube in 2009 with a YouTube executive on the Metro in may have been late 2008, I can't remember, in Manhattan. I was traveling, saw him, and I I said, I want to partner with YouTube, yada, yada. I forgot to grab his business card. Within 6 months, everything I'd had on YouTube was on. Everything I had on YouTube was on YouTube. We had the first playlists. We had to continue to play videos. And even in 2012, they just ripped the entire site off. And I have a video, a flame video on it, where they just violated my copyright and just took WikiTube TV and just, made it YouTube. It was called YouTube Red back then. I made a video, and obviously that video did something because they did away with it, right? Because I showed the direct copyright violation. I think any attorney will look at that and say, yes, this guy is right. You are directly violating and copywriting his work. Anyway, but some of the aspects is still there. I was so infurious at that time that I said, is the startup broken? And if so, how would I fix it? How would I fix the startup? And that led to the whole idea of the Open Innovation Framework. Creating a framework that allows for innovation to launch without the need of closed capital networks. And to transform the paradigm of success equals access to closed capital networks to success equals validated idea that you call an ICO. An ICO has nothing to do with the distributed ledger. A DAO has nothing to do with the distributed ledger, right? So the idea of doing what you call a white paper. But why, the question is why is it that that I created this? I'm going to get some, sit down here where it's a little less windy. The question is why? Why did I invent it? Well, I'll tell you why. When I started going into the whole idea of decentralization, first I had to define a startup. And another great question is to ask people to define a startup, because no one can define a startup. A startup is not an incorporated vehicle, because there's all students out there, Startup Week, and they're launching their ideas through hackathons and everything else without an incorporated vehicle, right? People like the idea, then they incorporate it. At that point, it doesn't become a startup. It started from the idea stage. But if you talk to a VC, they'll say, well, no. A startup doesn't start there. It starts when it has so much funding, or it starts, if it's your SBA, it starts when you're incorporated, right? Because the angel and the accredited investors can't invest in it unless it's at something. In a way, that's changed too with the ICO, because technically you don't need to be an incorporated vehicle to do an ICO. Just a smart contract, issue tokens, right? But you won't get any accredited investors for it, or even look at Bitcoin. Well, you do, because accredited investors are buying Bitcoin. There's no entity around Bitcoin. There's a foundation, but they had nothing to do with Bitcoin, other than saying they're a foundation. Bitcoin.com, media firm. So, why did I invent the Open Innovation Framework? I'm sitting here, still rattling out here. This is simple. What I discovered, right, was that we were consuming 30 planets a year in 2010. Now, if you talk to economists, they blame the corporations for this consumption. Because I'm a startup guy, I actually went back to the very idea stage, right? And if you think of a game of Jenga, you think of, what are the things that drive investments in startups? How does this all start? But I realized it was a piece of broken code. And this piece of broken code, in economic terms, is referred to as CAGR, compounded annual growth rate. You see, Kaggle was either um, developed at the turn, at the turn of the Industrial Revolution, as a means and incentivization for rich landowners to put money into steam engines and railroads to build factories and everything else, and automobiles and everything else. Um, or it may have started as far back as, the Romans, who invented, who were big into taxation, and they compounded annual growth taxes and everything else. They also need to have large amounts of money invested in the country to do projects. So I'm tempted to think that it started there. But the problem is this, is that back then, the idea of consuming all the world's natural resources was something that is insane. Can you imagine even 100 years ago, oh, we're going to cut down all the trees. We better stop. We're going to create so much pollution that we're going to basically, heat up the air. Right? So what I realized that in order to fix and change out this code, I couldn't pull out Kaggle and replace it with a fixed thing, right? So what we had to do is we needed a new framework where we could lay down new blocks. And that framework, that cloth, so to speak, is the blockchain, right? Here's the problem, though. When Ethereum took my idea and they launched their white paper, they missed that very important point. And instead of launching the idea with the whole idea that the valuation system has to be built this way, they launched it where you're adding these new blocks on top of, Kaggle. So what we in fact have done is we've supercharged the consumption of limited resources because we have supercharged Kaggle. We have the blockchain as it stands right now with proof of work and proof of stake and Hashgraph and all this stuff. The creation of all these new millionaires, everything else, right? Hyperinflations. We have started to have an accelerated tipping point heading towards it. And I'm making this video as kind of like a warning, right? So I'm projecting from consuming 30 planets. By 2025, we're going to be consuming 120 planets per year in resources, okay? That's kind of scary to me. But the good news is we can fix it. We can start launching a new valuation system, the whole idea of CABR, compounded annual benefit rate, and the underlying technology, which are measuring the intangibles of how is the project affecting the planet, its living systems, and in sharing the knowledge and with others. Not just sharing the knowledge, sharing the wealth, right? Sharing the benefits. This is where universal basic income will come out of. So in our model, I like to say this: if you want to be a billionaire and destroy the world and consume the limited resources that it has, do a startup, launch an ICO, whatever. If you're interested in saving the planet, in fixing the problems, right, then do a found up. Launch a Dano. Danos are selfless corporations. There are no selfless corporations. Nonprofits aren't selfless. Why? Because you have ego involved in the corporation. Even a board director has ego, and they ultimately look out for their own self-interest. A found up that becomes a Dano is run by AI, and the AI will give recommendations or even do, drive the organization. So that is giving back. So in a Dano, the net profits of the Dano rolls back into the whole system. So the point of the blockchain is to usher in social capitalism. So why was the blockchain, what's the real purpose? To change the code, usher in what Jeremy Rifkin's called the empathic civilization, do away with Noam Chomsky's wealth and power cycle, right? Which is ushering in social capitalism. Social capitalism is where we're headed. It's capitalism for the 99%, not for the 1%. And as blockchain enthusiasts, the first thing you have to understand is it's not the blockchain that's doing all this. It's the open innovation framework.